It was a Thursday afternoon, September 19th, 2024, a date no one on the Family Feud set would ever forget. The cameras were rolling, the stage lights glimmered across the studio like a halo, and the audience was alive with laughter. Steve Harvey had just wrapped another round between the Johnson family from Cleveland and the Roberts family from San Diego. Two spirited groups trading jokes and playful jabs. It was business as usual, the rhythm of television at its best. Energy, charm, applause, punchlines. Steve had done this thousands of times before. He knew the rhythm of every segment, every cue. But that day, something beyond the script was waiting in the shadows. Something that would break the format, stop the laughter, and bring an entire studio to silence. As the commercial break ended, a camera operator began the routine audience pan, a smooth sweep across the smiling faces in the stands. Steve, ever the professional, shuffled his cue cards, chuckling with the families about the next question. But then, mid-sentence, his eyes lifted toward the monitor. Someone caught his gaze. His hand stilled. His voice cracked mid-laugh. The card slid from his grasp and scattered like fallen leaves across the polished floor. The sound of paper hitting the stage cut through the laughter, and a hush rippled through the room. The families turned to him, puzzled. The crew exchanged nervous looks. Steve wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just staring, not at the contestants, not at the camera, but at a woman seated in the third row, center aisle. She wore a soft floral dress, her gray-streaked hair neatly pinned, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her eyes were wet, not from surprise, but recognition. The camera hadn't meant to find her, but fate had a way of slipping into live television uninvited. And now, the man on stage and the woman in the crowd were locked in a wordless reunion that no one understood but them. 5 full seconds passed, then 10. In television, silence is deadly, but this silence felt sacred. Steve swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as if trying to believe what he was seeing. He took one slow breath, then another. Finally, his voice came, softer than a whisper, cracking under the weight of memory. "Ma'am," he said, "in the third row, the floral dress, could you please stand up?" Every camera turned toward her. The audience shifted, murmuring, unsure whether this was part of the show. The woman hesitated, covering her mouth, her shoulders trembling, but she stood, slowly, carefully, as if rising from 2 different lifetimes, the one she lived now and the one she had left behind almost 3 decades earlier. "What's your name?" Steve asked. He already knew. His heart already knew, but he needed to hear it out loud. "Dorothy," she said, voice trembling but clear enough for every mic to catch. "Dorothy Chen." Steve closed his eyes for a long moment, and then, for the first time in 14 years of hosting Family Feud, he broke protocol. He turned to his crew and said, "Stop everything. Stop the show." His producer, frozen in the control room, lifted her headset halfway, but before she could signal the cameras to cut, she caught something in Steve's face she had never seen before. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't stage fright. It was revelation. "Keep rolling," she whispered to the operators. "Whatever happens next, keep rolling." Steve stepped away from the podium. The audience gasped softly. He wasn't cracking a joke, wasn't smiling, wasn't performing. He was moving like a man in a dream, descending from the stage, eyes never leaving Dorothy's face. By now, tears were streaming freely down both their cheeks. Dorothy reached for a tissue, hands shaking, whispering, "Oh, Lord," under her breath. Steve's voice quivered. "Is it really you?" he asked, half laughing, half crying. "After all these years, is it really you?" Dorothy nodded. "It's me, Mr. Harvey," she said through sobs. "It's really me." The studio audience had gone silent. Contestants watched in awe. And Steve Harvey, the man who built a career on commanding a stage, did something completely unscripted. He stepped over 2 audience rows, apologizing as he went, and wrapped his arms around Dorothy Chen. The crowd exhaled together, a single sound of astonishment and tenderness. Cameras zoomed in, capturing a moment that wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, a moment that belonged not to showbiz, but to grace. For a long while, they just held each other. 2 souls whose stories had been woven together long before the world was watching. When Steve finally pulled back, his face was wet, his voice trembling but firm. "I looked for you," he said. "For 27 years I looked for you." She nodded gently. "I know," she whispered. "I saw some of the posts, but I didn't want to be found." Steve blinked in disbelief. "Why?" Her answer came softly, steady now, almost like a prayer. "Because I didn't do it for thanks, Mr. Harvey. I did it because it was the right thing to do." And with that one sentence, the weight of decades settled between them, and a story long buried began to stir, ready to be told at last. The air in the studio had shifted, no longer charged with game show excitement, but with something older, deeper. It felt like standing in a church, a place where laughter bowed to silence and hearts opened. Steve's producer motioned for the families to step back, and the crew quietly brought 2 chairs onto the stage. The game was forgotten. Prizes, buzzers, and scoreboards all seemed small compared to the weight of what was unfolding. Steve took Dorothy's hand gently, guiding her down from the audience stands. The crowd parted instinctively, their eyes wide with curiosity, their breaths shallow, as if afraid to interrupt something sacred. "Come with me," Steve said softly. "I need to tell everyone who you are." His voice trembled, but his grip was firm. When they sat together under the bright studio lights, it no longer felt like television. It felt like testimony. Steve took a deep breath, looking at Dorothy with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heroes. "This woman," he began, his voice cracking, "this woman saved my life." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Steve blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "I've never told this story before," he continued. "Not on air, not anywhere, but I think it's time." The camera zoomed in, focusing on his face, lined with gratitude, softened by memory. He looked down for a moment, gathering himself. "It was 1996, he said quietly, his voice taking on the rhythm of confession. "I was 40 years old, broke, and homeless in Cleveland, Ohio." The audience stirred. No one had ever heard Steve Harvey speak like this, stripped of jokes, stripped of pride. "I wasn't between apartments," he said. "I was living in my car, a beat-up 1976 Ford Tempo that barely started on cold mornings. I washed up in gas station bathrooms, $8 menu food when I could afford it. I was tired, I was humiliated, and I was ready to give up." He turned to Dorothy, his eyes glistening. "I was ready to quit comedy. I prayed one night and said, 'God, if this is not meant for me, take the desire away. I can't keep doing this.' I remember sitting there, freezing, shivering, my breath fogging up the windshield. I'd played a tiny club all week, 7 shows for $150. Enough to put gas in the car, but not enough to survive. Dorothy sat still, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes shimmered under the lights, as though she were back there with him in that frozen car 27 years ago. Steve continued, his tone softer now. I parked behind a little church on the east side. I figured no one would notice me. I thought maybe I could sneak in to use the bathroom before sunrise. I remember sitting there crying quietly so nobody would hear me. The studio was completely silent. Not a single cough, not a shuffle. It was as if the audience had been transported into that February night with him. The cold air, the loneliness, the sound of the wind rattling against the car door. Then, Steve said, his voice barely above a whisper, someone knocked on the window. A murmur ran through the crowd. Steve looked toward Dorothy. When I looked up, it was her, he said, his hand trembling slightly as he gestured to her. She was holding a thermos of hot coffee and a brown paper bag. She smiled at me, not the kind of smile people give out of pity. It was dignity. She smiled like I mattered. Dorothy's voice was soft, but steady. I was the church secretary back then, she said. I came early every morning to open the building, start the coffee, and prepare the bulletins. I'd seen that car parked there for 3 nights straight. And that morning, I looked through the frosted window and saw him sitting there, hunched over, wrapped in layers. I knew he wasn't just resting, he was living in that car. I remember being ashamed, Steve said, wiping his eyes. I thought she was going to tell me to move along. Instead, she said, "Good morning, sir. I brought you some breakfast. Would you like to come inside where it's warm?" I didn't even know what to say. Nobody had spoken to me like that in months. Dorothy nodded. He looked so tired, she said quietly, so defeated. I couldn't walk away. Steve looked toward the audience. She brought me inside that church kitchen, he said, sat me down, made me a plate of eggs, bacon, toast. I still remember the smell. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't judge me. She just let me eat, and then we talked. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I told her about my dream, how I'd been chasing comedy since 1987, how every door closed in my face, how I was about to go home, give it up, and take a factory job. He turned to Dorothy. And then she told me something that changed everything. Dorothy smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. I told him, she said softly, God doesn't give you dreams just to watch you abandon them. If He planted something in your heart, it's because He intends to grow it. The struggle is not punishment, it's preparation. Steve covered his mouth with his hand, visibly shaking. Those words saved my life, he said. That morning, I decided I wouldn't quit, and it's because of you. The audience broke into applause, not thunderous, but reverent. It was the sound of gratitude shared by hundreds of strangers, all bearing witness to a miracle of kindness. Steve reached over, took Dorothy's hand again, and whispered, That was the day I found hope again. And yet, the story, as powerful as it was only beginning. Because what Dorothy did next would turn a spark of mercy into a flame that carried him all the way to where he sat now. The audience sat frozen in their seats, eyes wide and hearts trembling. They had come to laugh, to watch families compete, to forget their troubles for a half hour, and instead they found themselves witnesses to something deeper. Steve Harvey leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his voice shaking as he continued the story that had never before been told on air. "That day," he said softly, "after she fed me and spoke life into me, I thought it was over. I thought I'd just say thank you and move on. But this woman, this angel right here, she didn't just give me a meal. She gave me a second chance." Dorothy smiled through tears, nodding gently. "He looked at me," she recalled, "and I saw something in his eyes, that flicker people have when they're holding on by a thread. I knew breakfast wasn't enough." Steve chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that carried both gratitude and disbelief. "You didn't stop there," he said. "Every morning that week I came back to that church parking lot, and every morning she brought me food, clean clothes, and a place to wash up. She even gave me gas money to get to my shows." He turned to the crowd. "You have no idea what that meant. When you're down that bad, when you feel invisible, just having one person believe in you feels like light breaking through darkness." Dorothy folded her hands. "I couldn't let him go back into the cold without hope," she said. "He was working so hard for a dream." You could hear it in the way he talked about comedy. It wasn't about fame or money. It was purpose. I just wanted to make sure he made it to the next day. Steve nodded slowly, his eyes far away, remembering every detail. "When that week of shows ended," he said, "I stood in that tiny club after my last set holding $150 in cash. It was the first time in months that a crowd really laughed. I mean really laughed, and I remember thinking, maybe I can do this." But I didn't know what came next. I didn't even have enough to drive to my next gig in Cincinnati. I was out of options again. He paused, looking at Dorothy. That's when she walked up to me with an envelope. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she remembered. "He looked so tired," she whispered. I could see him trying to act strong, pretending he had a plan. I knew he didn't. So I handed him that envelope. He didn't want to take it. He kept saying, "No, ma'am, you've done enough." But I told him it wasn't for me. It was a loan from God. Steve laughed softly, wiping his eyes. "A loan from God," he repeated. "That's exactly what she said. So I took it. I drove away that night with tears in my eyes, holding that envelope tight. I didn't open it till I stopped for gas halfway out of town. When I did, I saw what was inside. $300. Every dollar she had saved." The crowd gasped, and Steve's voice broke. "She gave me everything she had, not because I deserved it, not because she'd get it back, but because she believed in something bigger, in what God could do with a broken man." He turned to Dorothy, eyes shining. "You could have walked away, but you didn't. You made me promise something that night. Do you remember?" Dorothy nodded, her lips trembling. "I told you," she said softly, "when you make it, when the world knows your name, don't forget what it feels like to have nothing. Promise me you'll help others the way I helped you." Steve pressed his hand against his heart. "I made that promise," he said, his voice steady now, "and I never broke it. Every scholarship, every charity donation, every young comedian I've mentored, all of that came from that promise." The studio lights seemed to glow warmer now, softer, as though even they were leaning closer to listen. Steve's voice deepened, carrying the weight of a man who had lived a miracle. "When I left Cleveland that week," he said, "I had just enough money to reach my next show. And that gig, that one gig, led to a call that changed everything. A producer saw me, booked me on a bigger stage. That led to another, And little by little, God opened doors. I went from sleeping in my car to hosting this show. He looked around the stage, the audience, the cameras, and finally back to Dorothy. All of this, he whispered, exists because of what you did. Dorothy shook her head humbly. No, Mr. Harvey, she said, it exists because you listened, because you didn't quit. Steve smiled faintly. Maybe, but I wouldn't have heard that voice inside me if you hadn't knocked on my window first. The audience began to applaud again, but this time Steve lifted his hand. Wait, he said softly. There's one more part. Because after I made it, after I finally had enough money to breathe, I tried to find her. The murmurs grew again, curiosity reigniting. Steve's voice took on a quiet urgency. For 27 years I searched, hired investigators, posted on social media, asked every church I knew in Cleveland. Nothing. It was like she disappeared. He turned to Dorothy, shaking his head in disbelief. You changed my whole life, and then vanished. Dorothy gave a small, knowing smile. I didn't vanish, she said. God just had other plans. I remarried, changed my name, moved to California. I wasn't hiding. I just trusted that if we were meant to meet again, He'd make it happen. And somehow, impossibly, He had. 27 years later, on a random Thursday at a game show filmed in Atlanta, destiny had finished its circle. But Steve wasn't done. The gratitude in his eyes was fierce, almost desperate. No more waiting, he said softly. No more almosts. I've wanted to thank you for half my life, and I'm going to do it properly. Right now. The crew leaned in. The audience held their breath. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The studio had gone completely still. The game show lights flickered across Steve Harvey's tear-streaked face as he stood before Dorothy, his chest rising and falling with the weight of 27 years of unspoken gratitude. The audience leaned forward in their seats, feeling the air tighten, as though the moment itself were holding its breath. Steve wiped his eyes, looked straight at Dorothy, and said, You once gave me everything you had when I had nothing. Today, I'm finally going to keep that promise. Dorothy shook her head softly, overwhelmed. Mr. Harvey, she began, her voice trembling, you don't owe me a thing. Watching you become the man you are, that's all the thanks I ever needed. But Steve raised his hand, gently cutting her off. No, he said firmly, though his voice was thick with emotion. I owe you everything. My success, my faith, my second chance, it all began because one woman decided to see a stranger as worth saving. He turned toward the cameras, his voice steadying. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to witness something, because this moment, this is what life's about. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The audience watched, spellbound, as he dialed a number and pressed the speaker on. Carl, Steve said, I need you to draw up some paperwork right now. The studio whispered with confusion. Who was Carl? What was happening? But Steve kept talking, every word deliberate, every pause echoing through the room. Carl, I need a mortgage paid off, a trust fund established, and a monthly stipend. Whatever it takes, do it. He paused, looking at Dorothy. Do you own your home? Dorothy blinked, stunned. Yes, but How much is left on your mortgage? He asked gently. She hesitated, flustered. 5 years, she murmured. I only have 5 years left. Steve nodded, then turned back to his phone. Carl, pay it off, he said, his tone firm. By Monday morning, I want it done. The audience gasped. Dorothy covered her mouth with her trembling hands. Steve's voice softened again. "And Carl, I want you to set up a trust fund in her name, a monthly payment of $5,000 for the rest of her life. Make it happen." The crowd erupted in applause, rising to their feet. Some were crying openly now. Mothers, fathers, crew members, even the contestants who had come to play. Dorothy shook her head in disbelief. "This is too much," she said through tears. "I don't need all that." Steve knelt slightly, meeting her eyes. "You may not need it," he said softly, "but you deserve it, because you gave when you had nothing. You didn't wait for the cameras, the headlines, or the spotlight. You acted from the heart. And I made a promise that when my blessing came, I would make sure yours did too." Dorothy tried to speak, but her voice broke. The moment felt larger than life, like watching a prayer answered in real time. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned toward the audience again. "I've been blessed beyond measure," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "and I've spent years trying to find the woman who gave me hope when I had none. So today, I'm doing more than saying thank you. I'm making sure the world knows her name." He stepped back, motioning toward the camera crew. "From this day forward," he said, "I'm founding the Dorothy Chen Foundation, an organization that will help homeless men and women chasing their dreams in entertainment, musicians, comedians, actors, anyone sleeping in their car wondering if they should give up. We're going to feed them, house them, and help them reach their next show, just like she helped me." The crowd roared. The families on stage clapped, crying as they embraced one another. Dorothy sat speechless, tears streaming freely now. Steve placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is your legacy," he said gently. "You turned $300 and a breakfast into a foundation that will change thousands of lives." Then, turning back to her, he added, "And one more thing. Dorothy, I want you to meet someone." He gestured toward the audience. From the same third row, a young woman stood up, her face pale with disbelief. "This is my granddaughter," Dorothy whispered, her voice shaking. "Melissa." Steve smiled warmly. "Melissa," he said, beckoning her down, "come join us." The young woman hurried forward, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Did you know?" Steve asked gently. "Did you know what your grandmother did?" Melissa shook her head, crying softly. "She never told me. She just said she once helped a young man trying to make it." Steve smiled, turning back to Dorothy. "You didn't tell her?" Dorothy laughed through her tears. "No, because it wasn't about me. It was about God's timing." Steve looked at the two of them, grandmother and granddaughter, and then said, "Melissa, you're in medical school, right?" "Yes," she whispered, "but the loans—" "Not anymore," Steve said, smiling through tears. "Consider it done. You'll finish school debt-free." The audience broke into thunderous applause, the sound rolling like a wave across the room. Steve raised his voice slightly to be heard. "Because of this woman, I found my purpose, and because of her, generations after her will have theirs." Dorothy covered her face, overwhelmed. Steve leaned close and whispered, "You said the struggle was preparation. You were right. Everything led here. Every tear, every night in that car, it was leading me back to you." The two of them embraced again, and for a long moment, the world seemed to stop. Cameras captured it, the image of a man who had everything, finally able to thank the woman who had given him hope when he had nothing. It was more than television, it was full circle. Later, that episode would become the most watched moment in Family Feud history. The clip would travel across the world, shared with captions that read, "Kindness changes everything." But for Steve and Dorothy, it was simpler than that. It wasn't fame, it wasn't fortune, it was faith. In that studio, beneath those bright lights, a forgotten promise had been fulfilled, and two lives, once bound by chance, stood together again, living proof that miracles don't need scripts. They only need hearts willing to see the invisible, to give without reason, and to love without measure. That day, Steve Harvey didn't just stop a show. He stopped time and reminded millions what grace looks like.